Okay. Okay. All right. And you all know each other, so I don't think there's any need to go around and do introductions. And so my suggestion is we dive into it. We do have an agenda today that Jane had sent around. It's in the, you can see it linked to the chat, and I might share my screen with it in just a second. And we had the benefit of having a number of interesting presenters today, and that's really the focus of our meeting is hearing from these presenters and asking some questions. Jane, just checking, do we have a critical mass of task force members to get going? Okay, great. So this is what is sent around and is posted online, or actually I might want to make sure, is this the version that's posted online, Jane? I plugged this one out of my email. This is what Jane sent around. I'll talk about the ground rules in just a second, but before I do, let's just walk around and see what we're going to do today. Housekeeping piece of approving minutes, and then we've got this first block of presentations. And we've got some very interesting folks with us today. It's a lot terribly fair, but we've asked each of them to do about a 10-minute presentation so that we do 30 minutes of presentation total. And then that gives us a good amount of time to have some Q&A with them. And after that, we'll do some public comment. All right, so we have this first block. And presenters, thank you all for being willing to come, and equally hard trying to do something meaningful in 10 minutes. So I appreciate that willingness to do that with us. After public comment, we'll come back for a second block of presentation. This just a single presenter, Laura Haight, and she'll have about 15 minutes of presentation. We'll have another block of discussion and another block of public questions at the end of that. So that's our meeting today, 2 blocks of presentation. I believe everybody's here from the presenters. I'm just looking around. Ground rules. You all wrote these ground rules for yourselves. They are the most poetic and graceful ground rules I've ever seen. I absolutely love them. And thank you all who took the pen to help turn these and put these on the page. If you look at them in their grace, what they're saying, right, is let us listen to each other even as we're taking care for ourselves, right? Let us speak our truth, even as we are understanding that our words have impact on others, and we need to be thoughtful about that, right? And let us ask things of each other, knowing that we don't all get everything we need, right? And let us be present. So these are really great ground rules. I'll help everybody stand by them today. I ask also that folks who are joining us as members of public observers, that they also stick with these rules, because it's for everybody as we're together. A few other things, chat. Let's keep chat just for questions folks have, and for any citations or things like that where it's helpful, or like what we just did where we threw the agenda and the link in there. Let's keep chat for that. It's super distracting to have parallel conversations or things going on or comments going on in the chat. Let's keep that chat for citations, or if there's a question from a task group member. And when we get to public comment, if members of the public would prefer to ask a question in the chat in that period, that's perfectly fine too. Okay, that's probably more than enough from me. Any quick questions about what we're going to do today before we dive into it? Anything folks want to say before we get going? Judy, go ahead, please. Do you want me to drop the agenda? Hang on one second, Judy, you're still on mute. Hang on.
As a member of the Social Equity Caucus, the White Affinity Group from that caucus has been developing a protocol for witnesses in public to speak. And that draft protocol is currently 6 pages long. And there's a process for writing in the chat box that they are suggesting the Secretary of the House, or whatever she's called, I forget what she's called, the top person there. She has supported this and is continuing to support the creation of it. And there is a process in which public can chat. And that chat goes to the secretary person for that committee. And then that person will put it out there.
Okay, so it's like there's a pass, like it goes to some person and that person can put it out. Okay.
Yes, and I would suggest that we do that because many of the comments we get are important and they should be shared at the time we're discussing that. So like, for instance, I don't know if you are the person that would be, or Patrick or Jane or whomever, but that needs to occur. There needs to be an opening because many of our guests on this committee have knowledge that nobody on the committee has. And it's wise to hear that. The other thing is, which is prominent in the language on this protocol, is providing a space that is safe and welcoming. And I feel it's important, and at the SEC meetings and the other meetings we've gone on, people have had a choice to be passionate about their beliefs and not be cut off for being passionate for their beliefs. And I think that we should be able to do that as well. People should be able to state their opinion, and whether it's passionate or not. I mean, on the SEC committee, people cry, people scream, people yell, but they get it out. And I think that's important because this is a public meeting. And where else will the public do that?
Yeah.
So I think those things should be included in what's happening.
Okay.
Because it's a two-way street. The members of this committee get to be passionate. They get to explain their opinions and their feelings. And because this is a public meeting, I believe the public should be able to as well.
Yeah. So could I tease two things apart just quickly on that, Judy? I think that's really interesting. I wonder on the chat thing, if we could circulate that document and do that in a subsequent meeting once folks have had a chance to sort of digest what that suggestion is,
Yeah,
and how that would work, and channeling it to somebody else. And
yeah.
I think that sounds really interesting. And I think folks might want to sit with that for a little bit, and how, like, I'm feeling uncomfortable being a gateway for comments right now. So I'd love to be able to pick that up and think about that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
On the second piece of speaking passionately, my read of the way you wrote your ground rules was there was nothing there that said you couldn't be passionate or say things with a really strong, in whatever space, right? Speaking your truth, right? In the way you need to speak it.
Exactly.
The boundary piece, as you all wrote, the boundary is you need to understand your impact. So if you're doing things that are disparaging or disrespectful, you need to understand that impact and have some self-control around that impact. That doesn't mean you can't be passionate.
Right.
I think that's where you're going with your ground rules.
Exactly. Because those policies that you just read off, those ground rules, are the ground rules I use in my classes. And I shared them and they posted them. And I think it's important that people understand that passion and excitement is feeling like telling the truth. And that's okay. We should be able to sit through people telling the truth if they're excited. And so, yeah, that's what is being said in those ground rules. But that's not always what's happening.
Got it. Okay. And super. And the tricky part is understanding everyone, the difference between passion and disrespect, right? And that's sort of where we're trying to navigate, I bet, in these conversations.
Right. And so anyways, the affinity group of the SEC is still working on this form. It's in draft form. And as a member of the SEC, we talk about it regularly. So I don't know if you want to wait till it's done or what. But I was told that this will be, once it's addressed and final, it will be something that everybody will follow, all state agencies.
Okay. I would say, Judy, on that, let's circulate what's a draft now, and then you all can make a decision, probably not at this meeting, about how you want to do that, particularly as it relates to chat. So my recommendation for this meeting is let's use the chat sparingly, as I discussed, and then let's look at what Judy's going to send around and see how you all as a group want to take that up. It sounds really interesting, the thinking that's going on there. All right. Yeah, you bet. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and get in. We've got a lot of interesting folks to hear from today. We have that one housekeeping thing, which is around the minutes. And so for approving the minutes, if anybody needs an extra second to look at those minutes, do that now. You can click right through the agenda to pick them up and look at them. Let me just give folks a sec to do that. Would anybody like more time to approve the minutes? Okay. Any concerns about the minutes? All right, I'm not seeing any, so let's treat those as approved. Thanks, everybody. Okay, so let's get into our first block of presentations. And I am going to just use the order that's on the agenda, unless somebody would like to suggest a different order. And I don't know everyone really well, except for Bill, who sits on our board. So I'll ask presenters to present themselves as well. And if you need a nudge when you're getting close to those 10 minutes, I'm happy to provide that nudge. If you don't worry. So we have first Dr. Juliette Rooney Varge from Umass Lowell. And Juliette, why don't I turn things over to you, and thanks for being with us.
Great. So yeah, my name is Juliette Rooney Varge. It's a real pleasure and honor to speak with you today. I am a huge fan of Vermont. I wish I could spend more time up there. I was sort of sad that I wasn't going to be there in person today, frankly. But I live in Massachusetts, so nearby and a frequent visitor. I'm a professor at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. And there I'm a professor of environmental science. I lead our climate change initiative, which is about a 42 faculty member strong cross-disciplinary center. We have 22 academic departments, literally everything from art to atmospheric physics and everything in between. And then also I co-direct our Rist Institute for Sustainability and Energy. I will hand it over to Bill to introduce himself, but I just want to also make a quick note that we're actually going to take a little bit of a different format than what was laid out in the agenda. We're going to co-present, and so we'll take, that's okay. So it's not going to be a strict 10 minutes, et cetera. And the three of us are actually sort of, Dr. Lori Siegel is here with us as well, I believe. She is a core part of our team, but it's going to be Bill and I sort of presenting things up front, and feel free to ask us questions as we go along. At least that's my take on things. I'll hand it over to Bill, and then I'll get us set up with the slide deck, and it looks like I can share my screen.
I'm Bill Umass. I'm a professor emeritus from Tufts University, where I founded the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy. I'm a physical chemist who 35 years ago switched from laboratory science, which turned out to be useful for environmental issues like reducing ozone depletion problems, and decided to work full-time on climate change and the issues that are related to it, biodiversity loss and numerous other aspects related to air pollution and so on. I have been a 5-time lead author of IPCC reports, which is a labor of love. There's groups of scientists are selected by their governments to spend 3 years, literally, of their own time at no pay, but travel to some interesting places several times and put together those monster reports. The last one that came out in August of 2021 and earlier August 2021, reviewing hundreds of thousands of papers by hundreds of scientists. And I've been working primarily the last 10 or 12 years on natural climate solutions.
Great, thanks. Jane, just want to ask, is our audio, ooh, that I'm getting feedback.
I think there's I would ask someone to mute. There we go. Yeah, if everyone else can just be on mute as well. And it just, Bill, your audio was a little bit low. So if there's some way to, get a little closer in or do something, that would be excellent.
Okay, let's give this a go and see if you can see, oops, hold on one sec. And full disclosure, I happen to be dealing with COVID at the moment. I think I may not be quite as speedy as I normally would be, but we'll get there.
Thanks for coming in. Apologies for mispronouncing your name.
No worries.
Incorrectly in the agenda.
Yes, I noticed that. It's not a problem at all. So again, really an honor to be here and really an honor for us to have a chance to share with you our work on this issue, which is such an important issue and really one that we think Vermont, New England more broadly has an opportunity to show some really global climate leadership on. So we want to frame this with that hope. So I think also before we dig in, I want to just note that I know you've already heard from many other people. And again, thanking you for that effort. I think it's really not easy sometimes to hear some of the science. There's so much complexity that sometimes that this issue is presented with. So I want to commend you for that effort to, insert some of that scientific integrity, complexity into this issue and into policymaking on this issue. And hand it over. And just want to make sure you can see one slide right now. Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
Yep. That
Okay.
looks perfect. Yeah.
Okay, so hand it over to Bill.
Okay, thank you, Juliette. We're going to be really discussing the findings about the implications of bioenergy for the climate. And climate change, the climate has already changed. We talk about climate change as though it's something in the future, but these are all things that have happened in the last few years that are related to the increased warming of the planet because of the release of so much carbon dioxide from combusting fossil fuels, from deforestation, from bioenergy, from everything that emits carbon dioxide. And the California fires, this great picture here from Death Valley in 2020 when it hit a record of 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Advertisement in the upper right, not to lust after ocean property. You get too close, you get awfully wet. This is what happened in 2018 with just an ordinary storm, a nor'easter that hit at super high tide, and levels have been rising. The droughts have been just catastrophic this year in the US and in Europe. We haven't had the intensified storms this year so far, but the season is far from over. We're getting more intense precipitation in the Northeast here. It's 55% more intense than it was in the late 1950s. And of all things, here's a village in Germany that's been there for 800 years, and it's never seen anything like this.
Yeah. And I think as Bill is, framing this, like really our goal is to ask this question about whether bioenergy will help or hurt Vermont's climate goals. And it's really important to frame that in terms of both the impacts that we've already seen, and as this group well knows, the emissions trajectory that is needed in order to meet our climate goals. So on a global level, we know that we need to have emissions by 2030, roughly 7 years from now, a little bit more than 7 years from now, and achieve net zero emissions by 2050. So beyond that time, achieving net negative emissions. So we just like to think about this is where we are today and where we need to consider where bioenergy fits within that framework. And of course, Vermont's own climate goals are aligned with that broader global goal of achieving net zero emissions by 2050 across all sectors and achieving long-term sequestration and storage of carbon to promote best management practices and achieve to achieve climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience on natural working lands. So again, that question of would bioenergy help or harm Vermont's efforts to meet its climate goals? And I think where this issue has gotten really confusing in many cases is partly due to a historical scientific issue and maybe even an accident, which is that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that UN body that provides the UN scientific body to provide information to policymakers about the science, separated the carbon cycle into two major domains, what was referred to as a fast domain and a slow domain, with the fast domain incorporating all land use change and the slow domain incorporating the transfer of fossil fuels to the atmosphere, the utilization of fossil fuels. So in other words, this was the idea that a fast domain sees like we have biomass carbon accumulating CO2 or carbon from the atmosphere, and then that carbon, if bioenergy is used, being re-emitted to the atmosphere, occurring over a scale of 1 to 500 years, incorporating both vegetation and soil, and the slow domain incorporating anything that was over 10,000 years. And so I just want to, again say, all right, does that mean that we can ignore or we can claim that anything that's happening in this fast domain is actually carbon neutral? I think there's been a lot of confusion around that we want to dig into and kind of take a look at. So we have developed a dynamic model, and Lori Siegel, who's here with us today, is the senior modeler who really did the crux or the bulk of that work with us as part of Climate Interactive. And I just want to lay out some of the core components of both what we modeled, but also what we see with the use of bioenergy in general, which I'm sure, again, is familiar to you. Okay, so if we have, with bioenergy, and I realize that in Vermont, you all are using wood chips primarily and not pellets, but essentially the other components are all the same. So we have some emissions that are associated with the activity of harvest. We have emissions that are associated with the loss of organic carbon or decomposition of organic carbon to carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. We have emissions associated with the transportation of wood to the places where it's either processed or used. And then, of course, we have combustion and release of carbon from the biomass itself to the atmosphere through the process of combustion. Okay, so the assumption, if we're that some policies and that maybe was implicit in the fast domain framing of this issue in the carbon cycle, is that needs to be offset, or that carbon uptake by forests that are regrown can take care of all of those emissions. But the problem, there's a few problems with that assumption, but we should note right off the bat that we have a situation where the processing emissions, so in our case, we compared wood bioenergy to coal, oil, natural gas, and zero carbon energy supplies, which we'll share that information shortly. But in the case of comparing it to coal, we see that there are higher processing emissions and also higher combustion emissions, even when we compare this to the most carbon intensive fossil fuel. Okay, so in addition to those problems that we are not able to offset those emissions completely, which I'll again dig into shortly, there are three kind of zooming out bigger picture problems that we see in the way that in looking at bioenergy. Okay, so one of those problems is, as Bill and I laid out earlier, unfortunately, we're no longer in a situation where we can delay emissions cuts, right? We need to have emissions in the next 7 years or so and achieve net zero emissions by 2050. So in other words, we need to have rapid emissions cuts now. And maybe the good news is that those rapid emissions cuts are possible with current technologies. And we're going to look at why that's a problem in many of the analyses of bioenergy. The other is that if we consider, and actually, let me before I go on to the next one, I'll just mention that this connects back to, in particular, what I know you all have heard about already, I believe, is carbon payback times. What are the carbon payback times? How do they compare to our carbon debt payback times? And how do they compare to actual zero carbon sources of energy? And what are the counterfactuals that we're using when we consider the actual impact, when we calculate those carbon debts and payback times? The other issue is that growing the use of wood bioenergy, which continues to accrue carbon debt, leads to accruing carbon debt faster than that carbon debt is paid off. Another way to think about that is that it's kind of like trying to pay off a credit card debt, a growing credit card debt, with a credit card. And again, we're going to dig into that as well. And the last really important point that I want to make is that this idea of eventual or delayed carbon neutrality that comes after the forest regrows, is not the same thing as climate neutrality. Even temporary worsening of the climate, and we're going to show you some modeling work that actually indicates it's not so temporary, causes irreversible climate damage. And that is something that needs to be considered when this idea of delayed carbon neutrality is considered. Okay, so digging into each one of those three problems, we'll start with the first one. So with this need for rapid emissions cuts, critical point is that we really can't afford long payback times. Again, we need to consider the fact that we have about 7 years left to have emissions. We need cuts now. We also need to consider the reality of counterfactuals. So often, and you may have heard examples of wood bioenergy being compared to different counterfactuals, like is wood displacing coal? Is wood displacing oil, natural gas? And I think that's really something that we need to, our own analyses, we compared wood bioenergy to coal as well. But given that we need to be headed towards actual low carbon energy sources as soon as possible, and we need to maximize forest carbon removal and storage potential, never mind the fact that Vermont's current electricity generation does not rely heavily on coal. It relies primarily on low carbon sources like hydro, wind, and even some solar. it doesn't really make sense to be comparing wood bioenergy to counterfactuals like coal. So I want to hand it over to Bill to also explain why it's important to consider the counterfactual of what the forests could be doing. And Bill, you're muted.
The standard statement in the apologies. I should know better by now. This is a map called the Carbon Online Estimator put out by the U.S. Forest Service, which unfortunately was taken offline during the Trump administration and does not seem to have reappeared. But this is one that I had. So it's 2010, which is a little bit in the past, but it is still useful to look at. The colors represent different carbon concentrations. They use metric tons per hectare, but just think of it as tons per acre. How much carbon is in a forest on each acre? And there's some striking things here. There's big green area through most of southern Vermont, New Hampshire, western Massachusetts, even down into Connecticut. Another big green blob over in the Adirondacks in New York State and a little further down in the Catskills. And those are at the high end. And the high end number here is 131. Next to it are these bright pink areas, almost all of Maine, northern New Hampshire, the northeast corner of Vermont, and just across Lake Champlain in New York State. Those latter areas are within the woodshed of the McNeil power plant, and I don't have any data to demonstrate that is because of that, but it means that the amount of wood that is available in that woodshed is relatively low, like 3 times lower than in the darker green in central and southern Vermont. The other fact to know is that U.S. Forest Service estimates that 95% of New England forests are less than 100 years old. So only 5% of the forest are more than 100 years. And yet our species mix has trees that live 2 to 3 times that long. And as they get bigger, they are accumulating more carbon out of the atmosphere. And you'll see why it is that the figures that Juliette will show you in a moment for different scenarios between now and 2100 are so different for the forests that are older, and they can continue to accumulate even more long after 100 years. Juliette?
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
On that previous slide, how is forest defined? Is there a minimum acreage or density or other factor that distinguishes forest that has the ecological functions of forest versus an area that has trees?
No, this is simply tons of carbon per acre, regardless of how it's there. So plantation forests are much lower density because the trees aren't very old. You know, if they're all harvested.
So there's no functional assessment of the ecological values of these forests. Okay.
No. Next slide, please. And this is illustrated, the fact that these older forests are important, more important, shown by a study that was done recently in Oregon, which has actually the largest big areas of high carbon density left in the lower 48 states. But you can see in this photo on the left, there are a lot of clear-cut patches there in the forest. This is national forest lands. And so a study was done of how much carbon would be accumulated between now and 2100 in million tons of carbon. And one study suggested if the harvest were reduced by half, that half of the forest, national forest and private forests are being cut now, were not cut. They would accumulate about 150 million tons by 2100. If we reforest all these patches, it'll be about 50. And if we plant new trees, every place they can be planted, it would be about 17. I mean, that's such a huge difference. And the reason is because these older trees that are allowed to continue getting older are removing and accumulating out of the atmosphere more carbon dioxide than carbon from the carbon dioxide than planting new trees today. So replanting does not give us back as much over the time period that we're talking about here as does allowing a significant amount of the forest to continue growing.
Great. It looks like Charlie Hancock has a hand raised.
Sure.
Do you want to ask a question?
Thanks, Juliette. I just wanted to clarify. So it looks like what we're talking about here is strictly volume of carbon sequestration. More trees, more carbon, less harvesting, more trees, more carbon. But I guess I question the title here, forest-related climate mitigation strategy, because as I think we all know, when we think about adaptation and mitigation around climate change, it's a much greater portfolio of things we need to do. And so I guess I'm wondering, is this really the most effective forest climate mitigation strategy, or simply just the most effective strategy in terms of increasing carbon stocks as we're talking about right now? So I want to be sure that we're kind of not becoming very, putting blinders on to essentially the other portfolio of strategies that we've got out there.
This is look, the goal is to keep as much carbon dioxide out of the air as possible. And so building up the most carbon in the forests between now and 2100. Remember, we've got to be removing more. I mean, remarkable thing today is that in the world, 30% of the emissions that we emit every year don't appear in the atmosphere because they're taken up by forests. And the goal is to stabilize carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at a level that will not create dangerous climate problems. And the way to do that is to have more in the forest. So here it is. There's more in the forest if we reduce harvest by half. The Forest Service did a study in 2016 that showed that the actual act of harvesting releases every year about as much carbon as the burning of all the coal in the United States. Or to put it in other terms, the emissions from all buildings in the United States. So that's not helping us. And it doesn't mean we don't continue to harvest trees, but we may not be able to harvest them and keep all our forests so young that they don't store much carbon. That's basically the argument.
Yeah, and I think just so I see see Judy's point to ask us to hold questions to the end. So my apology for that, Judy. Just want to, and point out too that climate mitigation, of course, refers to the carbon balance and reducing the cause of climate change. So and I think it also raises this I think common misconception that younger forests are the way to keep forests growing faster, when in fact it's really the actual accumulated stock of carbon, and whether that stock of carbon is, if we have a loss in the stock of carbon in forests, that carbon is being transferred to the atmosphere. So if we look at a counterfactual, and again, Lori is here today with us as well. Lori, please feel free to chime in if you want to do so. But we have a dynamic model to take a look at, to actually look at calculations of the carbon, to track carbon in biomass, dead organic carbon and soils, and the atmosphere dynamically over time under different scenarios. So we took a look at one scenario that is relevant to Vermont, where, as Bill explained earlier from that image of carbon intensity on land, we have more than 95% of forests in New England being immature, less than 100 years old. So if we start with a forest that is about 50% of its equilibrium carbon intensity at time zero, In this specific example, it's a New England maple beech birch mix, but we could take a look at many other types of forests that we have parameters for. What we would see is that over time, let's say we start the simulation in 2025, we allow it to go out to 2100. Under a no harvest scenario, we would see a gain in the amount of carbon stored over time. So this is normalized so that we're at our starting point of considering a utilization of bioenergy, which I'll do in the next slide. We have 100% of the carbon stored. So if we let the forest grow over time, then we start with 100% and we would end up with on the order of 160%, along with continued growth by 2100. So what happens if we harvest that forest? And in this case, we're only considering the biomass carbon. We're not including organic carbon leakage from soils. If we take a look at the biomass carbon from a 25% thinning harvest or a 95%, essentially a clear cut of that forest stand. And what we see then is, say with red, with the 95%, we're seeing a loss, of course, down of the carbon down to 5% of its original 100% in 2025, followed by regrowth of the forest over time, reaccumulation of that carbon in the biomass. And of course, with a 25% cut, we see a much smaller decline. So we're going from 100% down to 75%. And we see that carbon, getting closer to where it was, but still not reaching it. So the point here is that compared to if we think about carbon payback times, like when do we get back to the original stock of carbon, not including the full carbon payback, because we're not including what would have happened, what was lost to fossil fuel related emissions associated with harvest, transport, processing, nor are we considering the decomposition of organic carbon from soils that leak as a result of the harvest activity. But just with the biomass alone, if we left the forest alone, we would end up with on the order of 160% of the original carbon stored. And if we don't, and here we're saying your goals for Vermont, we're talking about a 2050 goal. With a 2050 goal, we're at not even 60% of the original carbon that was stored in that forest. So we have still a lot to make up. With a 2050 goal, in this case, we're not close to where we would be with the harvest situation, the no harvest situation, although we have grown back the forest to that original biomass. Looking at what would happen, in the case of, on the other side of that balance, I'm sorry. Okay, so if we look at the percentage of the original carbon debt that's remaining, again, considering now the full, in this case, comparing the full life cycle emissions associated with that harvest and using the bioenergy, comparing it to the counterfactual of a zero carbon supply of energy like hydro, solar, or wind, or energy efficiency, and comparing it, and part of that counterfactual also being the continued growth of leaving the forest alone. What we see is that by 2100, regardless of whether we're dealing with a 25% harvest or a 95% clear cut, we are nowhere near paying back that original carbon debt. So we're still dealing with on the order of 75% of the carbon debt in 2100, never mind 2050, for the 25% harvest, and with the 95% clear cut, we're well above 80% out in 2100, and actually still over that 100% or around that 100%, given the counterfactuals of a zero carbon, wood displacing zero carbon and allowing the forest to continue to grow. Okay, so Bill's going to take us through what would happen if we actually continue to use wood bioenergy and expand its use.
So the question really is, that I see in your documents, that should Vermont build new biomass electricity generation facilities, or should they expand the biomass electricity generation facilities, McNeil and Reigate, that they already have? And that's a very important question. And it depends on what your goals are. If your goals are to enhance the forestry industry, the answer might be yes. If the answer is to help slow climate change, then there's a different answer. So,
Bill, can you do me a favor and just speak up a little bit or move in a little
Sorry.
closer to the mic?
I'm sorry.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, it's just a question of what your goal is, and in this, we're looking at the goal being one of climate change. So you can see that pole of the discussion. So here's the McNeil generating station. You all know it well, and these are just some data on it. And the source is it burns 500,000 tons of wood a year. All right, that's 5,000 tons of wood that's producing carbon dioxide. And it's also reducing the capacity of the forest to absorb carbon dioxide, because little trees don't absorb much carbon dioxide. And had the trees been allowed to keep growing over the time that they would get back to where they were when they were harvested, they usually would have added more than twice as much, or their total would be about more than twice as much as you'd get from regrowing from scratch. It burns a mix of wood waste and whole trees. And I'm told that the whole trees are trees that were just not suitable for timber production, although they might have important ecological functions. I was surprised when I looked at the data on the efficiency of the plant, and as I see it, it came out that only about 20% of the heat is converted into electricity. And the assumption has been that the scale of this plant would be limited by the wood source transportation costs and remain fairly local. But as you can see, within that 60-mile radius, there's already been, for a variety of reasons, not simply because of McNeil, the carbon density, the amount of carbon per acre over the number of acres in a 60-mile circle is pretty low. Next, please.
Yeah.
Go
Sorry.
ahead.
Okay. So we in prior work, we actually took a look at what would happen if at the U.S. level we expanded the use of bioenergy. So this is the same general dynamic, thinking about this at a broader level, with end use bioenergy growing from near zero to about 0.8 exajoules per year over time. And when we take a look at comparing that scenario to a counterfactual of, in this case, actually replacing fossil fuel and the growth of an oak hickory forest in the south central United States, which is where much of the wood that's supplying the UK's Drax station currently is coming from. So with this particular counterfactual, what we see is that we have, again, this idea of accruing ever greater carbon debt as a result of expanding bioenergy. So we're continuing to harvest more wood, burn that wood, release carbon into the atmosphere faster than the forests can regrow to replenish resequester the carbon that was emitted. And that is actually with a counterfactual that's, you could say, the clear cut is less favorable than 25% thinning, but in the case of replacing a counterfactual replacing, or just where wood displaces fossil fuels as opposed to a zero carbon outcome, in that case, if we were talking about a counterfactual where we're actually considering a low carbon source of energy being displaced, we would have a much less favorable outcome in terms of the change in CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, which is what's shown on this bottom graph. So we see CO2 concentration continuing to grow over time as the use of wood bioenergy grows, because we're never getting to the point where we're paying back the dynamic carbon debt. So the last point that I think is critical and often completely overlooked in these discussions is that the idea of carbon neutrality that's delayed or that is eventual. So, back when the IPCC first made this distinction between land use with bioenergy falling under land use change and fossil fuel falling under the energy sector and the slow domain of the carbon cycle, we may have had more time to get to carbon neutrality than we do now. But even in that case, we would have been somewhat foolish to conflate the idea of delayed carbon neutrality with climate neutrality. And I'm going to show you a very simple modeling experiment that we did. And that's, you're certainly welcome to take a look at more closely in these papers that we've published to take a look at this question. So in this case, we ran a simple simulation of the climate impact of a pulse of CO2 emissions. So you can imagine that in the case of a forest or in bioenergy, the idea is, right, that you take this biomass, you emit carbon dioxide as you use it, and then resequester the carbon as the forest regrows. So an even simpler version of that, and a very sort of optimistic version of that, is that we have a pulse of CO2 emissions for 20 years, followed by a pulse of negative emissions or sequestration, in which every single molecule emitted is resequestered. So that at the end of a 40-year period, we're exactly where we started in terms of atmospheric CO2 emitted and sequestered. Now, what happens when we model that in terms of atmospheric CO2 concentrations and in terms of the impact on the climate? And we used our C-ROADS model to take a look at that question. And what you see is that over time, so as that pulse first occurs, right, where we're now emitting CO2 during this period of time from 2020 to 2040, as the CO2 is emitted, the concentration rises over time until the sequestration starts, and then emissions start to fall, or concentration starts to fall, my apologies. But if you take a look at what happens to the change in temperature, both in terms of, so as soon as those CO2 molecules are in the atmosphere, they're going to have an impact on radiative forcing and warming, leading to the accumulation of heat in Earth's climate system. As you may know, most of that heat actually ends up in the oceans. About 93% of it ends up in the oceans. So if we look at what happens in both the temperature and also the heat content in the atmosphere and the oceans, that heat that has accumulated, so it continues to accumulate with a delay as a result of increased CO2 concentrations. And because the heat capacity of water is so high, it takes a long time for that heat to dissipate. And in fact, even if we run the model out to 2300, the heat that results from that initial pulse of CO2 being fully sequestered is still not gone. In fact, a significant amount of it is still in the climate system all the way out to 2100 and beyond. So what does that mean? It means that even in this case, with a carbon payback period that ends 20 years after the pulse of emissions ends, we're in a climate situation that doesn't, a worsened climate that doesn't end for decades to really centuries. So in this case, we really, in that interim time where we have a temporary, or let's say, centuries of warming that otherwise wouldn't have happened, irreversible climate damage can happen, right? So the glaciers that melt during that time don't magically get refrozen. The sea level rise that occurs during that time doesn't get, reversed. The damage to infrastructure and to lives lost doesn't get replaced when the carbon is resequestered, even, and even centuries later when the climate is restored to its prior state. And another couple of questions that we want to address, again, I'll hand it over to Bill, is about this issue of residues.
And folks, I just want to make sure we leave enough time for, for questions. So let's try to wrap up the presentation in the next few minutes, if that's okay.
Sure.
We're just about there. One question is, well, if we don't burn these residues and things, what are we going to do with them? And it turns out there are a couple of things that can be done. There's some, it's since burning residues are years to decades compared to decomposition, that's been demonstrated quite convincingly. But an alternative is to use it to make things. And so many of these residues are big enough to make oriented strand board. And I just had some new basement stairs put in, and without discussing it or anything, I came back one day and there they were, made of oriented strand board, because that's stronger than using full boards. Many of the interior parts of my net positive home, a solar home, is made of oriented strand board. The floor joists are made of oriented strand board. The rafters are made of oriented strand board. There's a huge market for this, and there's a big economic benefit and jobs in this rather than burning. Another option is wood cellulose insulation. It used to be that we recycled newspaper. My house is insulated with 12 inches of recycled newspaper, all shredded into just cellulose fibers. And it's one of the best insulators there is, and comparable or lower cost than fiberglass. And there's a new, this has been done in Europe for years, using the residues this way. And there's a new mill, or a repurposing of a mill in Madison, Maine, that should be going online right about now, to make 3 different kinds of wood cellulose insulation. So that's an alternative which one ought to think about if one's thinking about this economically. Next. So the changing public policy perception and policy goes back to something that came into being in about the year 2000, that set the rules for counting forest bioenergy emissions differently from the longer lived ones. And the IPCC tried to correct this in 2013 when it said the neutrality perception is linked to a misunderstanding of the guidelines. Mm-hmm. Next. And you probably saw this interesting statement by Greta Thunberg just last week: burning forest for energy isn't renewable, now the EU must admit it. And on the right is just showing the results of fueling bioenergy in Europe from forests. Next, please. And this was a blockbuster of a headline, September 7th. Europe is sacrificing its ancient forest for energy, and governments are spending billions of dollars in subsidies. It's the only reason that bioenergy is viable, is because of subsidies. And here they are clearing some of the last ancient forests in Eastern Europe. Next. Now, Massachusetts just passed in their new climate law excluding bioenergy from wood is excluded from renewable portfolio standard and its subsidies. And this is a statement from the Boston Globe declaring that biomass electricity isn't renewable. That isn't quite accurate, I think, but it's that it's not good for the climate is the basic point. You only get so and one of the go ahead. It was very controversial. They were building planning to build a big plant near Springfield, and of course it was going to be which is already the asthma capital of the country, and a lot of pushback on the environmental and social aspect.
Yeah. So I think just to wrap up, what we're seeing, I mean, as Bill just went through, like I think we're seeing that there's a history here of wood being seen as renewable and good for the climate, but the reality, the science and the public perception, frankly, and also policy is changing. So I think that is something to keep in mind. Our own work shows that wood does not help Vermont meet its climate goals. And we therefore believe that wood should be excluded from Vermont's renewable energy standard and its subsidies. For the point of clarity, emissions should be counted at the point of combustion. This distinction between land use and energy sector emissions has resulted in a lot of confusion and in a lack of clarity in terms of emissions counting. We don't think it makes sense to expand the use of wood bioenergy, given that catching up with that carbon debt will be basically impossible to do in the time frame needed with growing the use of wood bioenergy. And we believe Vermont has an opportunity to leverage its forest carbon reserves and to create strategic forest carbon reserves so that those forests can do more in terms of meeting Vermont's climate goals. There are ways to do that without incentivizing wood bioenergy. And we would love to see Vermont take a leadership role in incentivizing private landowners in preserving forests for long-term accumulation of carbon, for which there is tremendous potential given where the lack of mature forests across New England and in Vermont as well currently. And that's all we wanted to share with you today. And we're happy to take questions.
That's great. Okay, thank you both so much for that complete presentation. We obviously are a few minutes behind if anyone's paying attention to the agenda times. Let's do some conversation among task force members and then open it up some questions to others who are here. Charlie, go ahead.
Thank you both for that presentation. I just wanted to clarify in the recommendations, and I guess more broadly, when you say exclude wood bioenergy, I want to make sure that we're clear on what we're talking about. Are you referring to electric-led generation facilities such as McNeil and Reigate? Are we rolling in kind of some of the more modern wood heat applications for residential use? Are we also looking at kind of the combined thermal heat power models? Because sometimes in these discussions that the task group has, we need to kind of set, what are we talking about when we say biomass or bioenergy? And so I just wanted to, if we could just make that clear in terms of which applications you're talking about in the recommendations, that would be great.
Yeah, so I'll give my 2 cents and then feel free, Lori and Bill, to chime in. That's a great question. I mean, obviously you all are deciding policy on, in Vermont for Vermont, right? And we're not gonna pretend to speak to, you know your landscape better than we do in terms of the political situation and the needs of the state. So I don't think that what we wanna do is really just share with you the insights from our work. Those insights do apply across different kinds of wood bioenergy, whether it is for, certainly in the case of the production of electricity, that's probably the most concerning application. From my understanding, I don't think that anybody on this task group is considering changing rules for individual homeowners to use wood to heat their homes. So we did, and we certainly didn't model that, although I don't expect it would be, it may be somewhat more favorable in terms of the outcomes if wood is locally grown or where, depending on where the wood comes from, et cetera. I don't expect though that you would have very favorable carbon debt payback times in that situation either. But I'm not pretending to speak to that. I think in this case, it's the main concern is whether, or my understanding at least, is the main concern is whether large scale facilities and centralized, policies that subsidize and support the use of wood bioenergy are being considered in order to meet Vermont's climate goals. And I don't think that would be wise to do given our own work at least, and let Bill and Lori pipe in.
Yeah, it's the big commercial ones that we're talking about here. There are plenty of good reasons why people locally cut their own wood. Low-income people, for example, that's a good. This has nothing to do with homeowners and the way in which they heat their homes. This is really about the incredibly large impact that the big plants have. Given the inefficiency of these plants, combined heat and power would be an improvement, but it would not solve the problem completely.
I think part of that combined heat and power question too, in my view at least, so like back 12 years ago when I was serving on our climate action plan for our university, I was jumping up and down asking our university not to invest in natural gas, which was what was the clean bridge fuel and what was going to get us to our climate goals and everything like that, right? I kind of see it like that. It's like natural gas, unfortunately, our university made a large investment in a central natural gas plant, which we're now stuck with for the next few decades because nobody wants to go back and tweak a multi-million-dollar investment that was recent. And so I think that's really the question when it comes to the combined heat and power. Bill is absolutely right. It would be more favorable than, increasing the efficiency is a good thing, except for if you're increasing the efficiency using millions, using funding that is going to commit you to using the wood bioenergy for an extended period of time over what you would otherwise have done if you didn't make that investment and instead transition towards true low carbon fuels. So I think that's the concern that I have when I hear, because I know that McNeil, for example, there's consideration about improving it to, improving its efficiency, but it's so much like that natural gas story. And boy, do I wish we were not stuck with the natural gas that we have now.
Right. Actually, Dartmouth made a decision not to go that way, to shift their central heating plant to wood burning. Big discussion there. In fact, figuring out that they really would be depleting that wood shed pretty rapidly.
So a couple more hands from task force members. Richard, go ahead, please.
Yeah, hi. I'm Richard Hopkins. I'm leading an effort to write a second greenhouse gas inventory for the county in Vermont where I live, Addison County. And we have to decide how to treat wood. In our case, it's wood being burned for heating homes and businesses. This is not an electrical generation issue. We don't want to treat it like solar, and we don't want to treat it like coal. And so, we ran across this concept of a biological global warming potential, the GWP bio, which will have a value somewhere between 0 and 1. We've chosen a value of 0.35 based on what we've read. But I wonder whether you think that this GWP bio is a useful construct in understanding emissions from burning wood.
Well, the thing to remember, I think that the error is that we think that somehow forests have a capacity to recognize carbon dioxide that comes from wood and remove 100% of it. But they only remove 28% of other carbon dioxide. Every carbon dioxide molecule heats the earth the same amount, whether it comes from burning wood or burning coal or burning anything. And so that's just a fact, and you should take that into account when you consider it. But it's only removing each year 38% or 28% of the carbon dioxide that's released from wood in that year.
Yeah, and even there, so I just want to commend you for that effort, Richard. That is not an easy thing to undertake, and I know that it's you're probably dealing with a lot of thorny questions there. I think I would have to say that I don't find those emissions factors to be terrible. So I understand your dilemma, and I don't want to at all trivialize it, because I think it's a huge issue. But I personally don't think that those emissions factors are terribly helpful, because there are so many assumptions that are baked into them And just that the fact that delayed carbon neutrality is not climate neutrality is a huge point. Having said that, it's almost, I think you should keep an eye on how greenhouse gas accounting is evolving, because I think that it's going to change soon. My hope is that it's going to be a lot more clear. And I don't have, like, in my own view, again, is that we should be counting emissions at the stack and then incentivizing the growth of forests and treating that separately. But I don't have a really good like number to give you at the moment, other than, in my opinion, it should be counted at the stack. And I would not assume that prior greenhouse gas accounting approaches are going to stay static. I think they will change. So I wouldn't feel safe counting on like older greenhouse gas accounting approaches staying the same.
Yes.
And that's an issue for the state really writ large, right? That's a bigger issue, I think, for these large facilities, is like, can we, if we make this big investment, like Bill's saying, Dartmouth decided not to make the investment in a bioenergy plant, because even though current accounting rules would allow, like my alma mater, Colby College in Maine, considers itself to be carbon neutral in large part because of the bioenergy that it burns. I don't think they're going to be able to count themselves carbon neutral for long. That's kind of, you know, the sad reality of that situation. Anyway, I'll be quiet.
So we have another presentation we want to get to today. We also want to get to some public comments. I've got Judy and Adam with hands up. So Judy and Adam, if we could do like some quick reaction, maybe we don't get big answers from Juliette and Bill right now. We can do that later. I just don't want to crush Laura's presentation nor the public's opportunity to get in here. But Judy, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to crush them either. And perhaps if there isn't enough time, they can come back. My first question is about the wood burning furnaces that you see in people's backyards. We've been hearing from people that people are burning garbage, people are burning Pampers, they're burning all these terrible things to provide heat for their homes, and that it's nearly impossible to enforce it because by the time the constable gets there, the fire's burned out. Do you have any suggestions for that? Any comments for that? And I realize it's a smaller scale than biomass, but let's think of a backyard furnace burning nothing but Pampers.
Yeah.
And just before you guys answer, Judy, are there other things you wanted to mention?
Yes, there's one more question I have, but it's totally different. So
Okay.
I want to wait for the answer.
Okay.
Right. These backyard furnaces are a real problem. They have not been held to very high emission standards in their manufacture. I've had the direct experience. By the way, my northern property line is Vermont, so I'm very familiar with Vermont. My neighbor, has a little chunk in Massachusetts, most of his property is in Vermont, had one of these outdoor furnaces, and he put it in his garage. I came home one day and the fire trucks were there. He'd burned down his garage. They had to use all the water in my pond to put it out, and I'm glad to share that, but they're dangerous. And their emissions are uncontrolled, and they're supposed to be cleaner, but they're not. And as you say, you can't control what people put in them. I think the only solution is to phase them out, and that could be done. I mean, you probably don't want to snatch them away from people who have them, but you should not allow new ones to be installed. And those will either burn down the house and have to be replaced with something else, or they will wear out over time.
Thank you. My next question is about, we've been hearing a lot of talk about patch cutting and creating areas where you then get biodiversity, and that's important for sequestration. And I keep talking about traditional ecological knowledge and coppicing, and when a tree falls down in an area, planting that one space where there's an opening in the canopy. Can you explain to me the differences between the two? because it seems like there's a similarity, but it also seems like this patch cutting is a much greater size.
Yes. The patch cutting for biodiversity is usually to give a space for a species that needs an opening. It's called early successional habitat. Usually it's for species that don't belong in Vermont forests in the first place. They wouldn't be here. The only reason they were here is because Vermont was 80% cleared by 1850. And there's just been a paper that comes out that says that these patch cuttings, which are anywhere, actually in Massachusetts, they're trying to raise it from 5 acres to 30 acres on state lands, because that's what Fish and Wildlife wants. But this paper came out and showed that how destructive that was for biological integrity of the forest and of overall biodiversity. You may create one place that's good for woodcocks or New England cottontails, but it destroys the continuity of the many hundreds of other species that require continuous forest. I think it's a very bad idea. And besides, we have plenty of early successional habitat. You can see some of it behind me in this picture, which is right on the Vermont border. This area was harvested 40 years ago, and this is where it stands right now.
So when you compare that to coppicing and filling in an area that a tree falls down in, would you say that that was much better?
Oh, it's much better. And in fact, I mean, nature always fills it in. I had one of these blowdowns that knocked down a huge pine tree and several beeches. And that was 4 years ago. And the species that have come in, the trees that have come in are higher than I am right now. They're not very big, and but they do come back naturally.
Great. Thank you very much for your presentations. They were awesome.
Okay, so this is what I'd like to do. I want to make sure that we leave from 10 to 10:15 to have Laura's presentation. So let's take about 10 minutes of comments from those who are observing our meeting today or questions. And then at the top of the hour, let's transition to Laura's presentation. So if you've been observing this conversation today and there's something you'd like to throw in the chat now, it's a great time to do it. If you want to raise your hand and make a comment or have a question for our presenters, it's a great time to do that too. And I'll just remind everybody, let's stick to those very artfully worded ground rules that we had at the top of the meeting. Cheryl, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for coming to speak. I have one very quick question. Is there a way to use the modeling to count the carbon sequestration from now until 2050, now until 2100, mathematically, so that that can be added in to the Climate Council's efforts to come to can they count that to use in reaching the goals that the Climate Council has in the CAP?
So I'm sorry, David, did you ask us to respond to those questions or to wait?
Feel free if you have a quick response.
Oh,
Yep.
sorry. I thought this was the
Oh,
time.
no, that's fine. Yeah, no.
Yep.
So, let's see, quick response. What I can say is that Massachusetts, so there are many cases where states, I'm not sure what Vermont is doing, frankly. There are many cases where states are counting carbon accumulation in forests as part of their climate mitigation goal. What I would encourage you to, in other words, like Massachusetts is planning on being net zero currently by 2050, but that refers to an 85% reduction in emissions associated with a 15% increase in net sequestration. So what I would encourage you to do is to incentivize the accumulation of carbon in mature forests, and perhaps count it in one column, but not count it as offsets against emissions. for the reasons that we've already explained, that this delay, it really should go in two different columns, because the delayed carbon neutrality is not the same as climate neutrality. And also, frankly, because it's a little bit tricky to decide where that boundary is. In other words, if carbon accumulates in forests, should you also be counting the phytoplankton in, the Gulf of Maine as accumulating carbon? Like, where is the boundary of what nature is doing going to be sort of, is it a specific management decision? Is there additionality in that decision, or is it something that nature is doing anyway? I guess that's how I come down. Bill, you might have a different response.
Just very quickly, if you don't
Yeah.
count them separately, you don't know where you're gaining. I mean, it's like your bank account. If you
We don't want to offset.
If you only looked at the net, you wouldn't know whether it's because you spent less or you earned more. You need both those things to understand what you're doing.
Yeah.
Thanks. Richard, go ahead, please.
Well, I'd like to say thanks very much for the presentation. It's been very clear, and I would simply like to say, as a member of Vermont Interfaith Power and Light and the Bristol Energy Committee, been active in this stuff for a long time. Really, I strongly support the policy recommendations, and I think Vermont should eliminate biomass from its energy portfolio. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard, for the comment. Yeah. Okay, and I've been seeing quite a few comments in the chat, which is great. Thanks. This is a good time to do that. As observers and members of the public, it's a perfectly great time to throw a comment in the chat, or if you have a question. I haven't seen questions in the chat for our presenters, and I'm not seeing another hand right now. So why don't we switch gears?
There's one specific one to Dr. Muma, where
Yep.
someone's asking for a reference to a publication showing that patch cutting is not good.
Yes.
I can supply that. Yes.
Yeah. I'm also happy to just drop in the chat some links to publications that might be helpful for you in looking at this modeling work a little bit more closely.
Super. Thank you both. Okay, that's great. Okay, wonderful. All right, so let's switch gears. Thank you, Laura, for patience. Let's take 15 minutes for your presentation. We're going to shrink up a little bit the task force back and forth after it. And if Laura, you're available to stick around a little bit after our meeting too, if there's additional questions from the public, maybe that's something that can happen. But again, I don't want to push that on you if you're not available.
No, I'd be happy to stay later.
Okay, wonderful. So Laura, let me turn it over to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I'm going to switch on share screen so you don't have to watch my talking head too much. You might think that talking about Massachusetts is a very brief talk, but it's actually, there's quite a lot to say, and I think quite a lot that this group could learn from our experience, because it didn't just happen overnight. So let me get this going. Sorry. Can you see that all right? I'm going to move my
Yep, no, it looks great.
head out of the way. Can I just get this off? Hold on. All right, so this is you can see this taskbar too, right? So let me see if I can get
No,
that.
we don't. That you just see that.
Oh, okay, great. So first off, introductions. My name is Laura Height. I work for the Partnership for Policy Integrity. I work out of my home office in New York, and really thank you very much for inviting me to share our experience in Massachusetts and other places. Our organization was founded in Massachusetts, and over the battle over biomass energy and how it should be treated in our renewable energy policies. And my boss, Mary Booth, realized that this discussion was happening across the country, across the world. As you all know, it's very complex, and it's hard to find out what the truth is, what the information is. So we're now international, and I'm delighted to report to you that just 2 hours ago, European Parliament voted to restrict woody biomass from forests in their renewable energy directive, which is huge. It's a compromise piece of legislation. It doesn't go far enough, but it's really a seismic shift and really indicates how far we've come in communicating successfully the science behind biomass energy and why it is not a climate solution. So in Massachusetts, now why is this not working? Can you hear me all? Can you all hear me?
Oh, yeah, we hear you just fine.
Okay, so in Massachusetts, just last month, Governor Baker signed into law an extensive climate bill. But what we're here to talk about today is the provision that removes woody biomass from the renewable energy portfolio standard completely. And that's both electricity only and CHP. And it just grandfathers in the two plants. There's two small CHP plants that currently qualify for RPS. We actually already had a very strong RPS. So you might wonder why we went the next step to actually remove it altogether. It's a long history of this issue in Massachusetts, starting with in 2008, when 3 biomass power plants were proposed in Western Massachusetts, directly south of Vermont. And the gaps between these bullets really represent all the citizen activism that took place. Citizens, organizations, local officials, scientists, all gathered together, wondering why we were incentivizing these plants that are terribly polluting. So pressure on the Deval Patrick administration resulted in DOER, the Massachusetts DOER, commissioning the Manomet Center to actually evaluate what these impacts are. And as a result, in 2012, Massachusetts adopted the first regulations in the country that actually use science to determine whether biomass, specifically woody biomass, should be eligible for renewable energy subsidies. Now, these regulations, the key parts of the study, and I won't go too far into this because I think you've probably seen this, is that it takes many, many years for forest regrowth to occur, to even reach parity with the greenhouse gas emissions from the combustion of the wood. What I meant was carbon sequestration from forest regrowth. So, and it all depends on what technology you're using, whether you're talking about heat or electric and what fuel you're replacing. But this chart, and there's a link to it, I'll send the slides around to Jane afterwards, shows that when you're talking about mixed wood, that, for compared to a natural gas plant, it might be for electric plant over a century for those emissions to be captured. Now, we're not suggesting you build more fossil fuel infrastructure. We're just saying, why are you using renewable energy dollars or clean energy dollars to incentivize something that's so much more polluting than fossil fuels? So our RPS requirements, and I thought the task force might like this level of detail, I wouldn't ordinarily do this, included a number of considerations. Specifically, I want to focus on the 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions over 20 years compared to natural gas plants. And that was sort of implemented largely through the 60% efficiency requirement. Whoops, sorry. There are also very strict forest sustainability requirements. Now, those regulations gave existing power plants that were in the Massachusetts RPS till 2016 to comply. And the result of these regulations is no electricity only biomass power plant could possibly qualify because none of them is higher than 25% efficiency. Shoot. Excuse me, and I don't know what to do here.
No worries. No worries at all.
That just ate up 30 seconds.
No worries. We're all
Trying to
good.
talk as quickly as I can without losing you all. I think I know what to do. Throw it out the window is what I should do. Okay, so these were all pretty strict requirements, the result was that all of the electricity only plants, which were mostly in Maine, that were selling renewable energy credits in Massachusetts were no longer eligible to do that. Now, in in 2015, Governor Patrick came into office, and from then on, there was a real change in terms of the Massachusetts policies towards biomass, starting with developing regulations for the renewable thermal program for biomass that were significantly weaker than the ones for the RPS for biomass. And then in 2019, proposing amendments to the RPS to essentially streamline, those were the words, the RPS requirements with the APS requirements. So it's sort of an end run around the RPS. Again, a lot of citizen action, in particular coming from Springfield, where one of these 3 biomass power plants was still proposed. The other 2 sort of walked away after the 2012 regs were adopted. They just never got built because they needed those subsidies to be financially viable. There was significant pushback from Springfield, and which is an environmental justice community actually listed for several years in a row as the asthma capital of the world, of the nation, by the National Asthma and Allergy Foundation. And the governor, excuse me.
Sorry, just someone needs to mute that. Go ahead.
Okay, so in 2021, there's actually some pretty big changes as a result of that citizen pushback to by the Baker administration, for one thing. And I included this. This is going to carry me. Sorry, this has never happened. My phone never rings. You're going to all think that I'm an important person here. This could be because of the European.
Yeah.
No, it's not.
The other day, Laura, I was in someone else's office. I had to unplug the phone physically.
Yeah, I mean,
Anyway,
I'm thinking
stop.
of it. So anyway, I think I just did it. Where am I? With these changes, I completely lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry.
So no, don't worry. So you were right talking about Springfield and the issues around asthma and the issues around revoking that permit and the controversy.
Oh, yeah, I attached that. Jane shared that with the group. It's a remarkable letter because they actually revoked the plant permit. I mean, it's a technicality because it was so old. It's a very long story with that permit. But the real reason was because of the environmental justice impacts, so that the disproportionate health burdens of that community and concerns about particulate matter and other emissions from this plant. And they even cite links to increased incidence of COVID, worsening of COVID symptoms associated with those types of air pollutants. So it's remarkable. You should read it. And the Department of Energy Resources changed their RPS rules also in a very remarkable way to add protections for EJ communities. So one might ask, why did we proceed to go the step further by calling on the legislature to take woody biomass out of our RPS? And it would be an excellent question. I think you guys would want to know. The 2 changes were that requiring all units that are new to meet a 60% overall efficiency requirement, and to prohibit any unit that burns biomass fuel from qualifying for the program if they're located within 5 miles of an environmental justice population. So either one of those 2 changes would make sure that that proposed plant in Springfield would never qualify for the RPS. And I think this is one of the strongest EJ things I've ever seen, that provision. So what could be bad? Well, the fine print is this: it would have eliminated that requirement for all the existing biomass power plants if they claim to burn 95% non-forest derived residues. And I use the word claim because it eliminates the entire fuel tracking procedure established to certify compliance. They also significantly expanded the definition of non-forest derived residues, and they also removed the really strong forest and soil protections. So by this time, there was so much awareness in Massachusetts, public awareness, lawmaker awareness about the the many issues related to biomass, the health issues, the climate issues, taking money away from clean renewable energy, that we had a lot of support in the legislature. It was still really race to the finish. There's a cliffhanger. The legislature was set to adjourn July 31st, and these new rules would have gone into effect probably sometime this month. And the last day of session, they passed the climate bill. It had these provisions that, again, they take woody biomass out of the RPS and grandfather in the existing plants that qualify. So it was, we probably would have been happy with our RPS or satisfied with it. But the risk here was that the governor was making changes that would allow all these existing biomass power plants that are highly inefficient back into the state. And the public didn't want it. They didn't want their clean energy subsidies to be funding something so polluting. So 3 quick reasons why my organization opposes subsidies for woody biomass energy. One is obviously the climate impacts from the stack emissions. Biomass energy CO2 emissions are more than fossil fuel emissions, even more than coal emissions. Heating is more efficient, but still more efficient than electricity, but still quite a lot more inefficient than fossil fuels. Not that we support fossil fuels, we want the transition to clean renewables. Forest impacts, trees take a long time to regrow, all this. This is about 25 acres is about enough to fuel McNeil for less than a day. Health impacts. And I don't know if that's something that this group has looked into as much, so I wanted to focus a little bit on that with my time. This is just a representative sampling of a few facilities, but as you can see, for most of the criteria emissions other than sulfur dioxide, again, biomass per unit of energy is more polluting than coal. I usually say it's about comparable to coal. And nobody wants to be breathing from a coal plant, I'll tell you that much. And so who does breathe from this? Well, here's a map of Massachusetts, and that circled area there is Springfield, which really actually hits the mark for all 3 of the criteria for qualifying for environmental justice community in Massachusetts, which has to do with income and minority population, English language issues, and those 3, income, minority, and language issues. And I think this is really something that this group needs to understand, because Vermont now has an environmental justice law, which was just signed into law in May, and it requires a mapping of these sites. And if you look at the maps, these were just published in July, the area around where the McNeil plant is are clearly a cluster that's very impacted by cumulative environmental issues. I'll go to the next slide. I'm talking way too quickly and probably missing things that I wanted to say. But my understanding from reading the study is that when they did this mapping, they found that areas with high racial diversity and limited English proficiency were associated with greater environmental risk, much more so than simply the income factor. And if you go into the GIS, they go into quite a lot of detail, and I put a link in the slideshow to so you can go in and look at that deeper. So I would be remiss to be talking about health issues and not talk about wood heating. I know that's not the subject of this task force at this point, but there's some issues I really want to make sure you knew. Obviously, I'm sure you know that we keep on learning more every day about fine particulate matter emissions. And of course, there's other number of a whole range of cancer-causing chemicals that are also included in smoke pollution. It's also, spread across the state. It's not like it's isolated to one community where there's one smokestack. So, and there are sensitive populations everywhere: elderly, children, people with immune compromised health systems. I mean, there's just, you can't get away from it. There's always going to be a sensitive population that's exposed. In Massachusetts, where only fewer than 2% of our population heat with wood, found that actually wood heating accounted for 83% of all of the PM 2.5 emissions from our heating sector and 22% of the state's total PM 2.5 emissions. So that's a lot. And of course, in Vermont, you've got a much higher usage of wood for heat. I found this on a government website that more than a third of Vermont school children attend facilities heated by wood products. So don't overlook that. And when you get to that stage, I really encourage you to look at the study done by NESCAM. If you're not familiar with NESCAM, it stands for the New England, I printed it out somewhere, the New England Society, my whole desk fell apart when the phone started ringing. Anyway, it's public officials, includes representatives from all the New England states, including somebody from the Vermont DEP. And it's scathing. The basic results are, people like to talk about modern wood heating this, modern wood heating that. Well, it turns out EPA's assessment program of these claims is woefully inadequate. So I do encourage you to take a look at that. I know I've spoken really quickly. I just wanted to say that in the context of climate, and not, I think you've heard a lot of really good statements today about forest protection, but in terms of, climate and emissions, we really need to stop treating combustion as either renewable or as a climate solution. We have to count those carbon emissions. I don't know exactly how Burlington gets away with calling the McNeil plant net zero. I didn't get enough time to research into that, but that's the problem with most policies is in the US and abroad, is that they treat burning wood as carbon neutral, which of course is not the case. And also typically a lot of climate emissions programs only count greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion, not from biogenic fuel combustion. And that's why we're in this mess today with a lot of policies that haven't kept up with the science. But Massachusetts, I'm about to conclude, Massachusetts isn't the only one. Washington, D.C. also has strict limits on the eligibility for woody biomass in their RPS. They have a 65% efficiency requirement. New York just took biomass, all of it, just the whole broad brush, all of it out of its renewable energy definition. And as I said, just this morning, the European Parliament has made recommendations for reforming their renewable energy directive, which is very significant, even though the changes don't go far enough. So I will, with that, I know it's my 15 minutes is up, phone interruptions notwithstanding, and I am available to stay later if people have more questions than the allotted time.
Laura, thank you so much. And thanks for doing that in the face of adversity. Really appreciate that. I want to start with any questions or comments that task force members have, and then we'll go to broader questions from those who are observing our meeting today. So task force members, questions you have for Laura or reactions having heard that experience from Massachusetts and her presentation, things that we want to check in with on regarding that content. Task force members? Charlie?
Thanks, David. And hi, Laura. I'll point out that Laura also owns a very beautiful forested property over the hill from me here, so she has some truly direct Vermont connections as well. So I kind of just want to conceptually make a point that I think we're talking a lot about biomass, the impacts of burning biomass. We've got great data that we're considering. And our conversation today has also talked about forest management. And I just want to kind of put a warning out there that some of the conversations that we've had are creeping a little bit towards this false dichotomy where we're talking about either passive management or really intensive management. Laura mentioned that a figure of like 25 acres of forest land going in to feed McNeil every day. And I don't think she meant it that way, but some of the things we talk about around, especially large patch cutting, that it's all clear cuts, it's all big cuts. And I think this is something that has been an issue going back for decades, right? We had like the old growth wars of the 80s and what that turned into. out of some of that came some of the new approaches around the triad approach, multifunctional forestry. And I just don't want to lose that context. So I just want to make sure that as we talk about this, we understand that it is not this dichotomy of passive versus really intensive management. And we can have a conversation around forest management if we want to. I would love to. As a forester, I love talking about that. But just want to caution us when we think about the management of our forests outside of kind of the question of biomass, that it is not this dichotomy that sometimes can falsely be presented in these conversations.
Yeah, if I could speak to that, Charlie. I mean, there's somebody on this call, actually, I think Lisa Merton is on, has a wonderful, wonderful documentary called Burned, or Trees the New Coal, which I encourage people to watch. That focuses on a lot of the logging down in the US Southeast, where there's a lot of just horrible logging. It's clear cutting, it's taking every single twig, and sometimes in extremely sensitive ecological areas for conversion to wood pellets, which are exported to the EU, which has been really growing its use of wood biomass energy exponentially for the past 10 years. And some of those sites down the Southeast look like moonscapes once the logging is over. That is not what we see happening here, although I have noticed a lot more clear cutting in the Adirondacks. There's been a big increase in clear cutting in the Adirondacks. Not sure what's going on in Vermont, but that's really not what is typical at all in the Northeast. But because there's so much more information coming from the Southeast, often people do conflate the two. I mean, it's a complicated issue, and you know, I agree. It doesn't have to be moonscape versus, you know, unlogged forest. My focus is on the emissions in particular, but I think the forest damage and deterioration is really important because, you know, when we talk about all these net emissions calculations, they net out what future forest growth will reduce, but they don't actually, they don't factor in the foregone carbon sequestration. So what carbon sequestration might have occurred had those trees continued on, and they don't include soil carbon loss. So this is the forest. I'd love to talk more with you about this. We'll do that.
Excellent. Are there other task force members who have a reflection or a comment or a question from Laura's presentation? Okay. Great. I think that meant it's very, very clear. Judy, go ahead, and then we'll jump into some comments from observers we have here today.
I just want to thank the presenters and thank Laura for coming and having so much information to share in such a short time. And I also want to mention to Charlie that we have had many presenters talking about forests and patch cutting or whatever it might be called, but today we're talking about wood burning. And I was particularly happy to hear all the information that was shared on that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Judy. All right, so let's, I see some folks who would like to comment. Bart, go ahead, please.
Okay, I just had to, can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. I wanted to know from Laura, I have heard conflicting things on this. Have all the subsidies for large scale pellet burning for heating in Massachusetts been removed, or do we still have a huge subsidy? That's the fastest growing part of biomass burning, not chip burning. I'm wondering, is that still a huge problem?
Well, we were trying to get the law changed to both the APS and the RPS to get woody biomass out of it. We were less concerned about any new biomass power plants being built because, frankly, other than Springfield, there aren't any new proposals. But we were very concerned about the potential to backfill Massachusetts renewable energy goals by allowing these plants that had previously been kicked out of the RPS back into it with these changes. That was the big risk there. In terms of growth, the APS has, I think there's about 100 units now that are wood burning units, mostly small, medium sized. It hasn't grown as much as the forest industry anticipated it would, or the person who drafted those comments when he was at DOER and now runs a company that sells wood heating, predicted it would. Like I said, fewer than 100 units. It's a change that we would like to see made. Again, we're not saying that you shouldn't burn wood, especially we would never say that in Vermont because it's a critical form of heat. And many people heat their homes with wood, but that clean energy subsidies shouldn't be going towards that if it's more polluting than alternative. If it's more polluting than fossil fuels, why do it? Use that money for solar thermal, for geothermal, for efficiency, for things that really do reduce carbon emissions.
Thanks, Laura. And by the way, Laura, we do have 55 people on the call today, which is quite interesting. If it's sometimes it's helpful with acronyms, APS, RPS, just to spell them out, just so folks know if anybody doesn't know what those mean.
Like everybody, like all 54 of you.
Yeah.
The APS is our, there's the renewable portfolio standard, which is for electricity. And then there's the alternative energy portfolio standard, which was originally more for energy efficient production. So for CHP plants, combined heat and power plants, which are more energy efficient than just electric only. And then it was expanded by statute to include renewable thermal applications. So solar thermal, biomass was part of it with very strict limitations in the statute. And then those were the regulations that were drafted were, in our opinion, did not match the strict criteria in the statute. So anyway, that's what I'm talking about, heating systems, wood heating that's treated as renewable heating.
Thanks,
and
Laura.
incentivized.
Great. I see a hand up from Biofuel Watch. If you can introduce yourself when you speak, go ahead, please.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for the presentations, Laura and Bill and Juliette. That was very helpful to get that various perspectives, and I appreciate the committee allowed that to happen. My question is, so I've always been confused by this. You talk about a 60-mile radius for harvesting the supply to these facilities, but a 60-mile radius is not that big of an area. And this facility, for example, McNeil, has been in operation for decades now. So all that wood being harvested within a 60-mile radius over year after year after year after year, that has to have, I mean, I actually find it difficult to believe that that is even possible. And I've seen some of the maps where biomass facilities and their harvesting radii are mapped out, and they're often overlapping with lots of overlap between the harvesting radii for different facilities or for different uses of the wood. Anyway, I just wanted to sort of bring up that point and see if any of you have any comments to make about it.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of the reasons why we really thought this whole, there are a couple of reasons why we didn't like this change that the Baker administration was proposing of, allowing biomass power plants that burn 95% or more of non-forest derived residues to not have any efficiency criteria. For one thing is, that's basically saying that burning wood is carbon neutral, which is of course not true. Even if you're burning residues, real residues, it's not carbon neutral. And secondly was so unrealistic in terms of the sourcing. Some of the biomass power industry hasn't done very well in the US. A number of the biomass power plants, there was a big surge around 2008, 2009, 2010. A number of those plants just couldn't make it because of the fuel sourcing, just couldn't get enough supply.
Thanks. I see another hand from Andrew. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Andy Pertzlick. I work at the Department of Public Service. I had a question for the first presenters. I thought their presentation was very informative, specifically about the recommendations on the biomass electricity plants. And there are two recommendations there. I think were right on point for this task force. There was other slides about forest harvest in general, and a slide and commentary on particle board or other forest products being used for construction. And on the slide about the carbon impacts from what they call biomass energy, which I call biomass electricity, the use of wood products, all those other carbon emissions are the same except for the combustion. So I wondered if they had looked into the carbon accounting for wood products. So those particle boards or the mass timber use of wood has the same impacts that they talked about for the biomass electricity, except for the combustion. So I didn't know if since they talked about those things, if they feel like there is a net positive carbon for those other uses of wood, or are they really just concerned about the combustion?
Yeah, so I would ask Lori Siegel, I think is still here, I'm not sure, but she could certainly speak to this with a lot of with more detailed knowledge than me. But I'll just mention briefly that yes, like in our model, we do have the option to include long-term storage of carbon in products, like long-lived products that are obviously they don't have infinite lifespans, but they have a lifespan that's much longer than wood that's burned does. And you definitely would see a climate benefit relative to burning that wood in those use cases. I don't know, Lori, if you're there, if you want to speak to anything in particular, but I mean, I guess one thing that's nice about the modeling approach is that we can pretty easily evaluate different scenarios like that. But again, I don't know if Lori's here and wants to add anything to that. And I don't know if that sufficiently answered, or Bill, if you want to add anything to that.
I'll add something to that. The thing there are some studies that have been done on this, and one of them found that the claims of long-term storage and so on that are loosely made are sometimes off by factors of 2 to 100. And one example of that is that you can actually accumulate and store significant amounts of carbon in the cross-laminated timber and those sorts of things. The reason that that's suspect is you've got to take into account the fact that less than half of any tree goes into a long-lived product. I mean, the branches don't go into it, the roots don't go into it, you've got a square around, you make a lot of sawdust. And if you look at, there's a very interesting paper that Keaton put out in 2011, I think it was, just showing the consequences of different management, all of which he included the carbon storage as part of it. And not one of those systems came close to the unmanaged forest in terms of the amount of carbon it accumulated. Another study that was done, again, I work with these folks out in the Pacific Northwest, they found that for the 3 western states, when here in the Northeast, we've been cutting down trees for 400 years, so we're in a somewhat unique situation where almost everything is 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or 5th level of cutting. Out there, it started in 1900, and they tracked all of the carbon that had been harvested from 1900 to 2015. And what they found was that only 19% of it was still in long-lived wood products over that 100-year period. That so 19% was in wood products, 16% was in landfills, waiting to become atmospheric carbon dioxide or methane, and 65% of it was in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So in other words, it takes a lot of, you emit a lot of carbon to save the carbon you save. That does not mean that we shouldn't use wood products, but the claims need to be honest, and they've got to do the whole calculation and show what it is. And that might also induce more efficient use. And that was my point about the oriented strand board and the insulation, the wood insulation. I mean, the wood fiber insulation, it is, at least that is going to reduce carbon or global warming, because that insulation will reduce any fossil fuels that are being emitted to keep that building comfortable or make the hot water or whatever it's doing. So it's just a question of there's going to be harvesting. Let's use it in the most effective way, which puts the least amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that was those were suggestions of things I've come across and talked to people about.
Thanks, Bill. Chase, then Charlie, and then let's see if we're able to round up more or less on time here. Hang on a second, Chase, you're still on mute.
Thanks, appreciate that. I always make that mistake when I raise my hand.
Same.
Thank you to all of the presenters. I really appreciate the time and attention that you gave to this. So yeah, thank you for your time and for your expertise. I was hoping just to like zoom out, because some of this stuff is so weedy that it can be easy to kind of miss the forest for the trees, if you will. And this is a question I think for Doctors Rooney, Varge, and Muma. If we're looking at the different types of electricity generation sources that are options for the state of Vermont, which is sort of a broad space is what we're doing in this task group. The discussion often focuses on wood biomass electricity generation as compared to, and the compared to is often coal or other fossil fuel electricity generation sources, which of course is important. And I heard a lot of discussion today about how wood biomass electricity generation can be as problematic from fine particulate matter, toxic air pollution, and climate pollution perspective as fossil fuels can be. And some discussion comparing wood biomass to other forms of electricity generation, which, because Vermont doesn't get a whole heck of a lot of its electricity from coal at this point, and is primarily getting more of its electricity from hydropower dams, and increasingly, though still not a lot, but increasingly from solar and wind. I was hoping just at a high level, you could speak to the comparison of wood biomass electricity generation as compared to those electricity generation sources that are more prevalent in Vermont, such as hydropower and solar and wind, please. Thank you.
I'm happy to address that. I also just want to like apologize for my like COVID whatever fog that I feel like I'm in right now. I don't feel like I did a good job presenting at all, but so just to speak to that, I think it is a critical point. It makes, even though our own work has compared bioenergy to coal, right? We have a paper that's basically the title. Is it better or worse than coal? So even though we've done that, it really makes no sense. It makes no sense in Vermont because, as you say, Chase, you're not really using coal, which is great. So why would you assume that you're replacing coal when you're not using coal? You're not planning to bring in new coal plants. Like that's not the decision that's being made. Thankfully, and that's a great place to celebrate that we're at that place, right? And then the other point is like, what does it make sense to compare it to? Well, there's so many opportunities that we have with current technology. I know Bill lives in this amazing, passive net positive house that it's like my envy to have his house. But I think of energy efficiency. So there's a current reality in Vermont, which is already pretty low carbon. But there's also where Vermont is going, which is even more low carbon. So we should be comparing wood against the counterfactuals that will enable us to meet our climate goals that we have available to us today, right? And a key one that I think of so much is energy efficiency. I think it's probably it's like the least sexy of all of the choices, right? Slapping solar panels on your house is much more interesting. But in reality, it is the cleanest, most abundant, cheapest form of renewable energy or clean energy that there is. And it also has the benefits of being a form of energy storage and of helping the people who have the highest energy burdens lower those energy burdens and save money. And so I would strongly encourage you to, you know, and Bill brought up those great points about using your wood resource for those issues, like for cellulose insulation, for improving homes. I would strongly encourage you to look really hard at energy efficiency, and then of course at solar, wind, hydro, and the other options that you have. And Bill, I'm sure you want to add something to that.
Although I want to just recognize the time, and so let's try to wrap. And I want to make sure Judy has a comment. And so Bill, a quick reaction, but let's keep it quick.
The only reason my house is energy positive and carbon positive, you know, we're sending out more solar electricity than we use, is when we started, there was not a roof of a house that you could live in that was big enough for the inefficient panels we had at the time back in 2005. And so we had to make the demand really, really very low. And so our house only uses 16% as much energy for heating as a code-built house in Massachusetts at the time. So Juliette's point is really important. These are synergies where you can actually afford the solar panels if you don't have to pay for 10 times as many as you need, because you can do the same service as with less energy. As Amory Lovins once said, all you care about is having a hot shower and a cold beer. You don't really care how it's produced. And if you can do that with less carbon emissions and less energy use in the first place, and then less carbon emissions when you provide those services, we can get there much faster. And combine that with removing more by our forest, I think it's possible to make the goals that Vermont has. But we need them all pieces of it.
Thanks, Bill. Judy.
Somebody mentioned, and I'm not sure if it was Laura who, but the monitor for measuring fine particulate matter, where should it be? On the top of the smokestack or at the bottom of the smokestack? And Vermont has permitted McNeil to have a 10 instead of 2.5 for fine particulate matter. Could you comment on that, please, on those two questions?
I believe that the federal clean air regulations, it's really what's emitted at the stack.
At the top of it?
At the top of the stack, what's coming out of the stack. But you also want to have it where people are. What are they inhaling? So you need it in two places.
Okay.
And because one of the ways in which they originally tried to reduce that was to build taller stacks. And that's what actually led to acid rain, because then you've got all this sulfur dioxide going up and being around long enough to be converted into sulfuric acid. So you know, you can't pipe it away and be better off.
I haven't been able to verify this, but I believe it's at the base. And the fact that McNeil is built in a valley, the smokestack, the top of the smokestack is almost equivalent to the people living there.
Wow,
because you come out of the valley or the interval, and there's where the people are.
Yeah, well, you got to have it where the people are. That's really the most important place.
Okay.
I would just say also that, you know, you're really talking about cumulative environmental impacts in that area. It's not just, I mean, this plant might be, I mean, I looked at the permit. I mean, it's below the requirements, but when you add what's coming out of that stack with all the other sources, that's, you know, that's the cumulative burden. And that's what this new environmental justice law is trying to address.
Right, exactly, because 25 to 37 train cars a day using diesel drive right by their yards to drop off the chips. And then another, Lord knows how many trucks bring logs per day. So they've got exhaust from transportation, and they've got exhaust from diesel in the train daily.
All right. Okay. So thanks, everyone. We heard really interesting presentations. We asked some questions about it. A lot of comments were made in the chat as well as verbally. So thanks, everyone. Those inputs in the chat as well can become part of what this task group looks at as it shifts into its next phase. In terms of next steps, Jane or anybody, can you say what's happening next? When's the next meeting? What people can expect for this task force?
Sure, we're meeting next Wednesday morning. I think we have weekly meetings scheduled now between now and the council meeting on October 19th. There are 2 presenters next week as well. And Dr. Bunicor and another professor that I'm drawing a blank on right now, but we have 2 more presenters next week lined up, and we're still considering who we're going to have present on September 28th. So many wonderful people have come in to speak to us. I'm trying to remember everyone's names right now.
Okay, great. So next Wednesday morning, additional presenters. Charlie, last word, and then let's wrap up.
I just had a question, or kind of comment and question. As you pointed out, we had like 5 times the amount of people we usually do here today, which is great. It's always good to have people in the room. I did notice that WCAX was also here, and I just wasn't sure. There are some council members on the call. I just wasn't sure has CIX reached out to any of the council members involved in this. I don't recall CIX ever coming to an ag and ecosystem meeting. And certainly not a biomass task group meeting. So I found that kind of interesting that today of all days, they decided to pop in. Have any council members talked to CIX or understand where their heads are at with this, or whether they're reviewing other meetings or they're going to be here next time?
No.
No.
Okay. I just found that interesting. So.
All right. Okay, folks. Thank you, everyone. Everyone who listened in, task force members in particular, for helping to guide this ship. Next week, I think you'll be back with Pat. But I look forward to seeing how all these conversations turn out. And certainly the Vermont Climate Council is really interested to see what you all will be pushing up towards the council in the coming weeks and months. Take care, everyone. A special thanks to our presenters for coming in, volunteering their time. Really appreciate that. Very interesting presentations. We'll see everybody next week. Take care, everyone.
All right.